Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Research Works podcast. I hope you've been enjoying all the episodes so far. I hope you've caught up on all the EACD episodes as well. I've certainly been going back through them just to learn and to remember everything because we had a lot of conversations. And we're really excited to be back in the studio now. It's just me here, but I'm speaking to a returning guest, which I love returning guests, especially when we get to follow up on the work that they were presenting with us before. So welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Jacqui Barfoot. Welcome.
Hi, Dana. It's lovely to be back today.
It is so nice to have you back. You know, like a few years ago, just to recap for everyone to remember, we spoke about your article that was titled Including a Relationship Focus in Pediatric Occupational Therapy Interventions. And then you were introducing the pair model. And now we talk about the next phase. So you've been very busy. When I read this article, I was like, "Ooh, Jacqui, you have been busy." Now you're looking at the implementation of pair. And that's just so important in our early intervention and space at the moment. So the article for everyone, if you're following along, was published in the International Journal of Disability Development and Education just in April 2026, so hot off the press. And it is titled Activating Parents in Early Childhood Intervention, a multi-study examination of the pair model as an implementation strategy. Jacqui, before I go into the bio about all things great about you, how has this work process been? I mean, you're still smiling, you're looking happy. The progression from that to an implementation study, what was that like for you?
I have really enjoyed the process of the collaboration with both families and practitioners as we started to do this implementation. And I've also connected with honours students as part of being able to do these studies. So it's been really lovely, actually, in terms of both my growth as a researcher, but also the collaborations that it's led to with organisation, with honours students and with families and practitioners.
Yeah, you can really see that in this work. So let's get into it all, but let's give everyone a bit of a rundown about who you are first and all the work that you do, and we'll make sure that we get into our icebreaker too, so stand by, everyone. So Jacqui Barfoot is an occupational therapist, researcher, educator and consultant with more than 20 years of experience in early childhood intervention. She is committed, as you can hear, to supporting a shift in paediatric practice where parents are supported as primary agents of change in their young child's development, and parent-child interactions are strengthened to help optimise both child developmental outcomes and family well-being. Jacqui is a research fellow at the University of Queensland, the developer of the PAIR, which is a phased approach to including a relational focus model. Her work focuses on translating evidence into everyday practice by helping therapists and organisations implement family-centred, relationship-focused approaches. Alongside her research, Jacqui provides clinical services, reflective supervision, training and consultancy to therapists and organisations across Australia, including the Benevolent Society and Bush Kids. It's just a wonderful bio. I love everything about that and the whole focus on supporting people who are doing the work, in clinical practice and want that support. So that's why we're so excited to speak with you. Before we get into this whole paper, though, the icebreaker question. And I know this is one that everyone always gets worried about, but this one I thought was really contextual because it's that time of year where it feels like everyone is traveling. Everyone's hopping on a plane going somewhere. It's that mid-year break. So my question, Jacqui, is what's the most ridiculous or chaotic or unusual experience you've had when traveling? Do you have one?
Yeah, I do. Early on in my time as an OT, I took a position in Sri Lanka. So I was working for like an AusAid type role, and I was supporting parents to set up a school for their children with disabilities. And so I started in Colombo, and then there were parents in Jaffna in the far north of Sri Lanka that wanted some support doing something similar. And I was quite adventurous, and I thought, no worries, I'll pack up this car and head to Jaffna. And at that time, there were a number of checkpoints in Sri Lanka between Colombo and Jaffna. And at the first checkpoint, the people who were working out whether you could keep going or not thought it was very strange that a young woman had a car full of things and was headed to Jaffna when at that time not a lot of Western people were living. So they thought that I was a spy. I had to go through a huge amount of interrogation and my things were all checked very thoroughly. And I was trying to convince them that, no, I'm an OT trying to support parents with children with disabilities. And finally, they believed me and I was able to continue along my merry way.
Oh, my gosh, that is the greatest story. I think that one of the biggest achievements from that would be explaining what an occupational therapist is to people at the border. Like, how did you go about explaining that? I'm not a spy, but I'm an occupational therapist.
Yes, especially when, it taught me so much around cultural differences around understanding disability and what that means.
Yeah.
And so you're right, explaining what I actually do, even that was quite complicated and I think actually took me more down the line of being a spy at some parts of the conversation.
Jacqui, that is the greatest story. I was not expecting such a cool story when I brought this one up. Look, mine doesn't compare in any way. Maybe it's more about the language barrier. That's probably where I could relate to. My story probably goes back about maybe 15 or 16 years ago. And, when traveling back then, not that it's that long ago, but it's not like Google Maps was that readily available. We didn't have Google Translate like we have now. Maps you probably had to pre-download, onto your phone because you probably didn't have data. And our story goes that we were headed into to Brussels. It was our first time in Belgium. So I don't speak Flemish, nor do I speak French. And there's many languages in Brussels. And then we get this notification saying, look, because we had family that was going to pick us up in Brussels train station. And then they messaged us and said, look, they have closed down all the roads around the train station in Brussels because it's a car-free day. So we can't pick you up. So you need to head into the train station and get a train out to Liège. We're like, okay. So the train station is an absolute mess. We're like, what do we do? Because everyone's trying to find another connecting train. We get a train ticket to what we think is Liège. We're not sure. We get on the train, we don't know the language at all, and now everything is in like Flemish instead. And so you're looking at the train lines, we couldn't tell, we didn't know where we're going to land. We didn't know if we were headed in the right direction or not. And then it comes up to this place and goes, nothing sounded very French. And they all started to sound Flemish. So they were saying, we're going to land now, or we're going to come into the station of Luc. And I'm like, is that Liège? Like, it starts with an L. Do you think it's the same word for Liège? So we just took a punt. We got off that train station. We had no idea where we were. Desperately tried to look for some family who was standing on the outside. We're like, it's so funny when you don't have Google Translate, when you don't have maps or anything like that, where you're going to land. But it was just a really scary hour because, you could be traveling an hour in the wrong direction. And so that was my strange train station story. But I think it's the whole fact that it was in Brussels and that there were so many different languages and we didn't realize that was the case. I don't know. I think that was for me the most uncomfortable that I'd felt. But now I've got Google. I feel like it helps a whole lot. But again, it's a language thing, just trying to translate that. Ed, you're well-traveled. Do you have
I am.
a unusual travel experience story?
Well, I think I was not a participant. I watched this moment take place.
Oh no!
So I'm married to a beautiful young lady, and she and I travelled to the United States, and you land at LAX, and LAX is always a mess. So it's 2 or 3 hours of waiting, kind of get to that front of that queue, and you have to explain to the customs people about what you're there for, whether you're there for business or for pleasure. And so he asks, what are you here for? You here for business? And so my lovely wife decided to tell the customs agent that she's a tourist. However, it didn't come out as tourist. It came out as terrorist. So It was very quickly corrected, and I think the agent did a double take and probably didn't realise. So we could have been there for many, many more hours.
Really bad word to get confused with, isn't it?
Yeah. So I've never really seen my wife flustered, but that was one of those moments. So.
I love that the story between all of us, it's like this, like it's a language thing, it's a spy, it's calling yourself a terrorist instead of a tourist. I don't know. It's all a bit of fun. So anyway, I hope whoever's traveling and listening to this podcast that you are having a good travel experience and that nothing strange happens and don't get accused of being a spy. But if you are accused, make sure you have a good way of explaining what profession you actually do.
And don't mention you're a terrorist.
Don't mention you're a terrorist. Please don't. Thank you for sharing your stories, everyone. Thank you, Jacqui. Well, let's get into this paper. We've got so much to talk about. So let me give you all a bit of a rundown about what we're all about to talk about. So this study evaluated the PAIR model as a practical tool for implementing family-centred relational early childhood intervention. Across 3 linked studies, they found that while brief training improved practitioners' knowledge and confidence, sustained adoption and observable practice change were strongest when training was combined with reflective supervision. The research highlights that organisational barriers, particularly short service blocks and limited time for reflection, remain major constraints. It provides timely evidence on what is required to translate relational approaches into consistent, scalable practice that positions parents as primary agents of their child's development. So, Jacqui, looking forward to learning from you about this. And I thought, in your paper, you do describe the context of the Australian National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention. I didn't realise how long that was. What is that? Can you just tell us a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah. So that has been put together as a frame, a number of principles. And when practitioners and any person who's working with a child under the age of 9 with developmental concern, delay or difference uses these principles, they're associated with better outcomes for children. So they talk about that there's 4 core principles, being relationship-based, being ecologically based, being strength-based, and being rights-based.
Right,
and when we do those 4 core principles well, then it's much easier to do the other principles that are listed in this framework. And some of those principles are things like being family-centred or being outcomes-based. And I really like how they kind of say that these core principles are actually the things that kind of, once we're doing those things, it's then easier to be operating with these other principles that are also really important in this space.
I love how you describe that. And it's so important, isn't it, to actually understanding the core principles, which are really pillars of our practice and our approach and our mindset as we move forward with it. One thing that I notice as well is we often do talk about, family-centered practice, which is used sometimes quite broadly and potentially a little bit loosely. It would be good to sort of help define that before we move forward, because you do talk a lot about in your paper family-centered relational approach. How does that fit in within, what we call family-centered practice?
And we actually were quite, conscious of the language that we used around that in the paper, because a lot of services and a lot of practitioners do make a commitment to family-centered practice, and that involving parents as actively as we can as in the therapy processes. But we know that in the context that we're working in, it can actually be still very hard to implement family-centered practice really well. And so the thinking is, and there's alignment with this best practice framework as well, that when we think about some of the relational principles and we start with that actually makes it easier to be family-centered, because being relational is around how do we listen to parents, how do we build trust and collaboration, how do we consider positionality or the people that are important in this family's life. And in the new framework, they actually list really clearly that part of a relational service is strengthening parent-child interactions. And that sort of language isn't in family-centered principles principles as clearly as it is in relational principles. So we considered that given there is this commitment to family-centred practice and there's alignment between family-centred practice and relational principles, it actually makes sense to kind of say, when we take these relational principles and we're able to implement them, it actually means that it's easier for us to be family-centred. And that's why we then joined, I guess, the terms together.
Yeah, I love that. It makes so much sense. And I suppose when you were looking at doing this and developing PAIR, which we'll go into in a little bit as well, is what were some of the gaps that you were seeing, when it came to family-centred practice and relational approaches? What were you seeing that there were gaps in our practice?
I think sometimes what parents might be expecting a session to look like, and they might be thinking that the therapist will be doing most of the work in a session because that's just what's assumed, or they'll have the answers. And so what my understanding of, and looking at the literature and talking to practitioners and also some of the qualitative studies that have been done in this space, is that practitioners absolutely want to be providing family-centred practice and be in alignment with relational principles. But sometimes there's this mismatch between what a family might be expecting it to look like and us being able to slow down enough at the beginning to explain why we would work in that way, and also slow down enough to ask what the parent is actually hoping for and where there might be alignment with what they're hoping for and some of those principles. And I think in the service context that we're in at the moment, practitioners and families feel a lot of pressure to get stuck into therapy sessions really quickly to get the most out of them, and that there's a risk there that we don't then do enough talking at the beginning around, well, what are you actually hoping to get out of this, and what is that going to look like? What's your role? What's my role? And I think in our disciplines, we actually haven't had a lot of training around how to do that bit at the beginning to slow down. So I think there's a couple of reasons why we're in this situation where we agree with this in theory, but actually the operationalize it, like implementing it, that's harder.
Yes, you're so right about that. There's a lot of preconceived expectations, aren't they? And when that happens, you kind of just keep going with the flow of it, and you don't stop. You don't have the opportunity to stop to think about how that could be different or how you could change. And I absolutely agree. Things may seem really good in theory, but the actual implementation of it is a whole other matter. And so, looking at that in more detail, I can see that's why you wanted to do this in this study. Now, Jacqui, we spoke last time, and I really encourage people to go back to that episode when we spoke a lot more about PAIR. But do you mind just giving us a bit of a rundown summary right now about what the PAIR model actually is before we start talking about the implementation side of the study?
Yeah, sure. So the PAIR model is an implementation tool. So it's not a specific or rigid intervention that clinicians need to follow. And it came from an earlier study that I did where I developed a one-day training package on these relational principles and how we start to implement them in sessions. And in that study, we had 150 allied health practitioners that came part of that, and we've tested knowledge, skills and confidence. And they said, yes, like my knowledge and my skills and competence has increased, but what do I actually do in the room with a family?
Sure.
I need a model to help guide that, and I need some tools that go alongside that model so that I start to build my practice with these tools. And so that was what led to the initial development of the PAIR model and looking at these 3 phases of the therapeutic process. So the PAIR model is based on attachment theory, it's based on adult learning styles, mastery motivation, some models of child development. So there's a lot of things that have informed infant mental health kind of principles, things that kind of contributed to it as an implementation tool. And So like I said, there's 3 phases, and the first phase is around how do we gather information with families?
Yes.
How do we understand what they're actually hoping to get out of our sessions? How do we have conversations about roles and expectations? And in the pair model, we call that our contracting process.
Wonderful. Yeah.
When we're doing a case history with a family, how do we include some of the context or the relational aspects in our case history so that we really get a good picture of what's happening for this family?
Right.
And also when we're doing developmental assessment, how do we also include a focus on parent-child interactions and observing parents and children interacting as part of our initial process. And then we use all of that information that we're gathering with parents in that phase 1 to inform whether or not parent-child interactions are feeling smooth and easy and resilient or not. Because I think importantly in our area, when children have developmental differences, it can be much harder for children to give their cues and signals.
Yes.
And there's also a lot more demands on a lot of the parents that we're working for or working with.
Yeah.
And so it can be, for a few reasons, it can be harder to read the child's cues and respond. And what happens is when we're offering developmental guidance or a home program or some strategies, we know from attachment theory that will inadvertently put even more pressure on a parent-child relationship. And if we've got families where it's feeling harder to read a child's cues and respond to them, and then we give them developmental strategies, we potentially putting even more pressure on that situation.
Yes.
So why we then kind of slow down in phase 2 and kind of think about how do we strengthen parent-child interactions as a first step so that it feels easier. And when things are feeling easier, then when we offer our developmental strategies, there's not as much stress or pressure on the parent-child relationship. And then it's easier to implement some of those things or carry them out or practice them at home.
Yes.
So the whole premise is not about throwing anything out, any of our other tools as practitioners. It's about how do we bring things in so that it's actually easier for a parent to do these things with their child in the service of the goals or the hopes that they have for their child's development.
Jacqui, that was beautifully explained. I was captivated by that the whole way. I've heard you explain things before, but that was just brilliant. And it's just so timely, I feel, because, we often talk about all these ideas and strategies, and there's this pressure almost because, early intervention is this finite window. You've got to get on with it. And it's also a very stressful time for the family. And, you can't just keep loading people up because it has to come out somewhere. But then you're absolutely right. What you said before is, as therapists, we weren't trained to do any of these side of things, that communication, relational aspect. And suddenly we're thrusted into an environment where there's a lot of stress and pressure. And what do you actually do? And I love that you've developed these 3 phases to really walk us through it, and that the emphasis on relationship is just so significant. Can you tell us a little bit more about the pair training and how therapists can get involved in that? You mentioned before there was a 1 day. Is that still the case?
The other thing that came from that initial study was that clinicians said they needed a bit more time with the training and to process and to have more, I guess, case studies or opportunities to work through some of the principles. So once the pair model was developed, I then looked at how I could extend the training to 2 days so that there was more time to process some of the tools, to practice using them, and to think about which aspects of the tools or the pair model were able to be adopted into the particular setting that person was in. So it's now a 2-day training, and it follows the pair model much more closely in terms of this is what phase 1 looks like. These are some tools that you can practice using. Here's some video of me using it with family. So it's a very interactive training. and really thinking about what is the practitioner's first step or next step with that particular phase or that particular tool that I go through.
Yeah, brilliant. So then I guess that leads us into what you did for this particular paper. So maybe if you can walk us through, because there's a few different elements to this paper, isn't there? It's very comprehensive. It's wonderfully laid out. Do you mind helping us to understand what the main aim of this paper is now?
Mm-hmm. So the main aim was to, I guess, understand what sort of training or what sort of supports help practitioners from going from that theoretical stage to implementation. What sort of dose of training is helpful? What sorts of things after training are helpful? And what we really wanted to understand as part of that was the practitioner experience.
Yes.
So we did include some qualitative questions so that we could start, because this is a very early, it's almost it's feasibility still, and we're still trying to understand things to help inform bigger or more robust studies in the future.
Sure. And doing an implementation study, I imagine, it's very, very popular term at the moment because everyone wants to think about, how do we put research into practice, which I feel like as clinicians, we're always thinking that way, aren't we? Like, how can we make this work in real life? But when we talk about implementation, we do have some good frameworks, don't we, that we can follow. And I saw that you do that in this paper really beautifully. Do you mind just walking us through that a little bit? Because I feel like that we talk about implementation, but what do we actually mean by that when it comes to a study?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we use the CIFA framework in this study to help guide our thinking around the different components of what we were actually looking for and what we were trying to start to measure with practitioners as well. Like I said, this is a very early kind of implementation study.
Yeah.
So we were wanting to think about what are some of the barriers, what are some of the things that are facilitators, what are some of the components of the individual practitioner, but then also the system that they're working in. And CIFA is a nice way of, I guess, stepping us through some of the considerations when we're designing a study or thinking about implementation.
And it's an interesting framework, isn't it? It really is about, because when you first look at it, you're like, whew, there's a lot of components to it. But it really, did you just sort of look at the areas that, sort of just to help to inform maybe questions or implementation sort of outcomes? That's sort of how you use that framework. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So it's quite flexible for people to use in different contexts. They just need to walk their way through it.
Yeah, and thinking about what I like about it as well, like this particular body of work or this particular study, and then the bits that were relevant given that this is very pilot research as well. I think if you were doing a bigger implementation study, you could use it differently as well in a more systematic and structured way potentially. But we were just starting out with what are some of our first steps in this implementation process.
Okay. And so you then embarked on 3 separate studies to look at this as a feasibility. Do you mind just walking us through what you did? I think that'd be really interesting to do that before we get into what you found.
Yeah. And they were 3 separate honours projects.
Wonderful.
Built on each other effectively, which is why we decided to pull them together and publish it as one paper.
Yeah.
So the first study, often clinicians say to me, I don't want to do a big 2-day training. I just want to have a few workshops that help me understand some of the key principles as my first step. And so I thought, okay, great. Let's offer that and see what that leads to in terms of knowledge, skills, and confidence.
Sure.
So those were some online modules that we were able to it's very easy to offer online training modules. So we had a high number of practitioners who wanted to do those.
Wow, okay.
And it was really easy to get them to complete their knowledge, skills, and confidence scales and give us some quite, I guess, some just starting point qualitative information about their experience of the training.
Yeah.
But not surprisingly, with just receiving online training, there's not that opportunity to have the same group processes around and reflection and active engagement with the content, which came out in that study as well.
Wow.
That it was a nice starting point, but most of the practitioners said, I want more in-depth training now.
Yeah.
So I think interesting to think about our own journey with training as well, that sometimes we do need shorter workshops or shorter modules to spark our interest or to start us thinking, what's my next step? Do I want a more in-depth training? And potentially if I hadn't done this workshop first, I wouldn't have known that was something that I wanted to invest in, because it's a huge investment in our time, our energy and financially as well when we do bigger trainings.
Yeah.
So that then from there, testing, okay, so here's the next iteration of that more in-depth equivalent to about 2 days of training. And that workshop was actually split into modules so that it didn't have to be offered as a full 2-day package.
Right.
Because for a lot of practitioners, that again is quite difficult, but there was a lot more, I guess, dose of training in the second study.
Of course, yeah.
And also in the first study, the practitioners who did the shorter workshop said, we actually need support with implementation. We're wanting some ongoing opportunities through supervision or peer mentoring to talk about what's tricky about implementing some of these principles. So in the second study, we also added the opportunity for monthly group reflective supervision, where practitioners could bring examples of what they were trying with families, the things that were working well, the things that were a bit stickier, and through that group reflective practice, get a key takeaway, or what were they going to do in the next session.
Right.
So they'd always be leaving with, I guess, an action that they could take clinically as well. But in reflective supervision, we actually use a lot of the relational principles that we're trying to use with families, and we embed them into the reflective supervision process. So there's a lot of parallels between reflective supervision and relational principles. And the thinking around that is that we're then giving a practitioner the kind of felt experience of some of those relational principles.
Yeah, that's important. Yep.
So again, that means that we then can through having the experience of them ourselves, it's then potentially easier to implement some of those. So we're giving people roadmaps of some of these.
Beautiful. I love how you've stepped us through that, and I think that's the point, isn't it? There's the understanding what kind of training and what supports are needed, and you're right. Short, sharp workshops do serve a purpose in the sense of going, oh, what is this all about? And, would this be something that I'm more interested in? And I think that's a good way of kind of knowing, all right, this is worth investing my time into, but simply just doing a course probably is not enough, which leads us to, I guess, your main results. And I'm going to leave it to you to tell us, because I feel like there's all of them combined is probably quite important. What were your big findings here, Jacqui? We'll start with that first, and then we'll jump to the next part, which would be did anything surprise you? But let's start with your big main findings.
I guess overwhelmingly across the 3 studies, the practitioners said that they really valued the training and the support around thinking about these principles.
Sure.
And so that in terms of implementation, thinking it's feasible for us to work relationally as practitioners, because a huge number of practitioners said, yes, we absolutely want to be working in this way. We can see the value in this. And there are things that we can take into our practice that we see are a good fit for the work that we do.
Sure.
But for adoption to happen, practitioners did require support to do that. And that was more than just training. That the reflective supervision was key in supporting adoption of those principles and implementation of those principles.
Right.
And that takes time.
Yeah.
That this is not a quick kind of process from training to implementation, that even after 6 months of the reflective supervision, practitioners are saying, I've still got more that I'm going to be working on.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important as well, that we give ourselves grace with this, that if we're trying to shift our practice and work in alignment with some of these things, it will take and some of the implementation science talks about, it's about 2 years for us as practitioners.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't
That's
think we
fair.
give ourselves that grace.
Yeah, we often want that, once we've learned it, we should be able to put it into place. But that's the whole point of things that are, this is about people and it's relational, and that in itself takes time. And each scenario that you might meet will be slightly different, a different circumstance. So you're pulling on different skills. So I can imagine, from if we want to talk about dose, the dosage is going to be a lot greater because you're going to have so many different circumstances, so many different skills you must be pulling in, with each scenario to get that kind of practice in a way as well.
Mm. And in the third study, because that had much more of a qualitative kind of aspect to it, the key things that came out were the impact of some of the barriers for both families and practitioners, and the impact of the current systems that we're in, but also of expectations of what therapy will offer or might do. And the practitioners who we interviewed said that when they were able to work in this way with families, they saw huge shifts, and that kind of thinking about parents as agents of change or strengthening things in alignment with what parents are actually hoping for, just how powerful that is.
Yes.
But and also how important it is that we actually have time and space to think about what can get in the way of that for both ourselves as practitioners, but also for parents in terms of engaging in this time of working. So I feel like there was a real depth to that third study to help us understand, again, what we can take from that in future studies to support both parents and practitioners with implementing this way of working.
Yes. What are you seeing in terms of, there's some good practical take-homes at the moment, aren't they, in terms of things, I know, and I'd love to talk about your future work and what that's going to look like now. But with this work that you've learnt already, which is already so really as a feasibility, it's fantastic in terms of the depth of information that we've received. What does this mean for practice now? I think it doesn't matter where you are in the world, it always feels like it's always a finite resource. We're always working with finite resources. And it always feels like there's just pressure on the ground. Clinically, there's so much to do. There's the admin load. And then if we're saying to, slow down, which always like the scary word, slow down and develop those relationships, allow that to take time. When everything is so activity-based funding, I suppose, like how would you sort of counsel and support therapists and potentially even organizations of how we can integrate some of these in now with what we've currently got?
I think some of the tools, I'm noticing the contracting map that is part of the training now has been really helpful for a lot of practitioners around how to have those initial conversations. And we're not talking about slowing things down like for months with families. It's just about slowing down enough to have a good conversation about roles and expectations. So I think that's an important thing to note that.
Yes.
But also we need to think about how do we structure our intake? Like, do we have scope to have a parent-only session so that it's easier to have that conversation right at the start? So some of those, I think those concepts require us to have the space to think about our processes and are there tweaks we can make so that it is actually easier to slow down at the beginning, not indefinitely, but just so that we can do some of that.
Yes.
And one of the people that came through a recent training, he said to me after the training, he said, what I'm struck with is that we feel all of this pressure as practitioners, and I think families feel this pressure too, that we have to get to the therapy fast because that's what's going to make the difference for our children. And that pressure to go fast means that maybe we're not actually understanding what the real needs are here or what might be helpful as a first step. And when we don't have that understanding, then maybe our supports aren't actually as effective as they could be. So we see gains quite slowly, even though our intention is to help and come in fast to help.
Yes.
And he said this lovely quote that that I think he'd heard from another service, that instead of going fast at the beginning, there's a risk when we do that then it actually all slows down and we don't actually see the outcomes that we're hoping for.
Yeah.
So the pair model, he said, helps us shift from fast, slow to slow, fast.
Love that.
Because when we do really listen and understand what it looks like at the moment, what parents would like it to look like, and what's going to be most helpful, we often see gains more quickly for children.
That's beautiful. I think it's, without oversimplifying this, it's kind of like, we're all trained to probably the same language most people speak as doing a SOPIA, and you've got your subjective, and it's almost a bit of a tick box exercise once you start doing it that way, right? And so your subjective is like, so tell me how your day's been, what's happening. It's so quick, then let's get into the objective. But really what's happening here, and I hope I'm not oversimplifying, please correct me, but we're basically saying in that S, we're just putting a greater emphasis. We're putting structure around that, greater skills around that to actually get a more comprehensive S to then guide the O. And then as we're then analysing and looking at our interventions, what we're planning for, we're just, we are doing what we've been trained to do, but we're just giving more time at the beginning to gather more information, because it's just, that is care as well. I saw a slide at EACD recently, and it was communication is care. And, we have to value that if we are to support the family and the child to have the best possible experience and outcome. And I completely agree with you. I think it's just about a reframe of the current available resources that we really do have so that we can maximize the outcomes, isn't it? So it's not about saying we need to do more or we need more time or more of those things. I suppose from an organisational and structural perspective, it's more about the time for supporting staff of the training or for that reflective practice. What would your thoughts be around that in terms of like how often that needs to happen, or who can do that reflective practice with the staff members? What are your thoughts on that?
I've noticed, and this was another thing with study 2, was that the whole team had the training. So there was a common language and there was a common understanding of the phases and also the tools that accompanied them. And I think that makes it much easier for clinicians, because then, and also for this ongoing group reflective supervision, because if you've then got a more senior clinician on your team or a team leader that can help facilitate that reflective supervision, you've also got a staff group that are all have a similar understanding of what we're talking about.
That's right. Yes.
I think it's harder when only 1 or 2 people from the organisation have had the training or have this kind of thinking, because it's a little bit harder then to kind of think about the implementation support or the reflective practice sessions that go alongside it.
So we all go together, really, is the key. We all go together. Just a remark now, just really specifically for the Australian context within NDIS, how do you see this fitting within the NDIS models and practice? Because obviously it's, the Australian early childhood approach as well. So what are your thoughts and comments about that?
For a long time, the NDIS have been talking about the importance of strengthening parent capacity, but I think sometimes the service context has made it hard to actually do that and to do that well, and the way that potentially, like even if with school-age children, how do we actually do that when children are at school and therapists might be offering a service at school? Because logistically that kind of makes sense. But for whatever reason or depending on the goal. So I think we need to really hold in mind that there's a lot of evidence and a lot of thinking around the importance of strengthening parent capacity, but it's how do we do that I don't think we had as much understanding of in the NDIS. Like, what would that actually look like for families accessing the NDIS? And we've potentially got more information now, and we've got more research as well that's happened during that time. And so we've seen some of the barriers of what can get in the way with the NDIS model to actually truly be building parent capacity. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to reflect on our practice and think about these principles. And are there tweaks that we can make in our intake process or in our contracting process so that we can be in more of that alignment with these best practice and building parent capacity.
Yeah, and it's a great call to action, and it's something that we can all do in our practice. We can all stop to have a think about what it is that we do, and we're not perfect, and we all know we're not, but we always want to make these tweaks. And I think just these gentle tweaks here and there don't have to be drastic, do they? It's just it's start in the process. Before we get into where to from here, because I know that you've got some research and more studies to go, maybe in terms of where people can get this training from, I'm sure people will be listening to this going, oh, this sounds really good. Like, is it still something that they can get access now, or is it still part of research?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can access this now. So I offer, because I have a couple of roles that I do, I am offering the training through my role at UQ, so that participants would pay to access the training. Yep. And then I also offer it on the days that I'm not at UQ to organisations, or as like a live online option as well. So there are a few different ways of accessing it. And I'm hoping that in the future, if I was able to get significant funding, then I would actually be able to offer it at a less of a charge to practitioners to support a bigger rollout of this and the implementation support. Yeah. But that will require an MRFF or something.
Yeah, okay. Another big grant. No, well, fingers crossed for that. So where to from here for you now, Jacqui? Where does this work take you?
So we have actually done another study that looks at goal attainment and parent and practitioner experience of receiving or providing the pair model. So after this kind of first study that looked at more of the knowledge and implementation of some of these principles, we then wanted to understand, did that lead to goal attainment for children, and what was the parent's experience and the practitioner's experience of using this.
Wonderful.
So that will be published soon, hopefully. And we've also been able to secure a translation grant where we are going to be doing, because none of these studies have got control groups. So, in terms of really being certain that we saw the changes that we're hoping to see, we didn't have a control group with them. So the next step is to run a little study with the Queensland Children's Hospital on their infant team, where we're going to have a control group. Tuesday babies will receive the pair study if their families consent to that, and the Thursday babies will receive care as usual, and we can actually start to understand, was there a difference, and was it the pair-informed principles that supported that?
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so you'll be busy for a little while. Congratulations on getting the grant. That's fantastic news, and it's good to see the evolution of this research continuing from there as well. I love hearing about the process of it, because it is a long process, but it's definitely a commitment. But there's so much value in doing it robustly if we're going to recommend these as well. Well, thank you so much, Jacqui. Look, we're not done just yet. We're going to go to our final segment, which is Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, he is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but now at over 300 episodes, he's getting a little bit more savvy. He's learning a whole lot more. So I'm sure he'll have a question for you. But before he does, Jacqui, I'll get you to summarize this work in about 60 seconds or so. And then, Ed, you'll have time for one question. So over to you first, Jacqui.
So we know that parents are the most important people in a young child's life, and most of the activities that children are doing, there's a parent or a primary caregiver present with those activities. So it makes a lot of sense for us to think about, how's that going from the parent's perspective? Is it easy to read the child's signals and respond to them, so that when we offer any developmental guidance, then that feels easier to practice at home in between sessions as well. And for some of the little ones that we work with, it might actually feel a lot harder to read cues and respond. And so then it is potentially going to be a lot harder to try any of these other developmental strategies. So the whole point of kind of thinking about parents and supporting parents with their child's development is, how do we work with what matters to the parent, and how do we work in a way that makes it feel easier to be with their child and to support their child with the things that are important for their child's development.
Beautifully said. Well done, Jacqui.
Great.
Not a single in there. It was just so great. Well done. So good. All right, Ed, over to you.
Today's conversation's been great. I guess I haven't really thought about how that kind of works in that kind of a therapy, clinical kind of setting. I guess I do have a question, and I know like a lot of therapists kind of go into allied health or this kind of work because, you know, they genuinely want to help. They seem to care really deeply. You know, they're trained to kind of step in and make things better for the child. And I guess that instinct, to me, I think it can sometimes kind of slide into what I guess I'd probably term like the messiah complex, the rescuer complex, you know, where the therapist kind of feels like they need to be the one that fixes things or saves the situation. And I guess I'm curious about how that kind of a mindset might actually get in the way of providing good, like early childhood interventions and therapies. And I'm just wondering how the pair model kind of might help a clinician move away from that kind of I'm the central expert in this situation or the hero in this situation and kind of become a bit more of a, you know, a coach, someone who partners with the family or with the parents.
That's a really good point. And then I reflect on my training as an OT, as an undergrad OT, I was trained to work with the child. I wasn't trained to think about the parent's experience or how to truly collaborate with or partner with the parent. So this is a shift. And I think whenever a parent is worried about their child's development and they're coming to us asking for help or ideas, it's very hard not to kind of get hooked in to the discomfort, you know, like, of course I want to help and try this or do this.
Yeah.
Because it's human nature when someone is coming to us with asking those sorts of questions. So I guess acknowledging that it is difficult to think about how do we slow down, and rather than rush in to offering advice, are there a few more questions that we can ask so that we've potentially got more of a picture of what might be helpful?
Sure.
Or can we ask questions in a way that actually build parents' sense of competence or their confidence, rather than when we offer something too early, we might actually inadvertently be reducing the parent's sense of confidence.
Yeah.
And so I think that really there's a great TEDx talk called The Advice Monster. And I think it summarizes your question so well, Ed. And I think for practitioners listening to this, I always recommend listening to that TEDx talk because it talks about how when someone's saying, what should I do? Our advice monster kind of, I've got something to add here. I'll save the day.
I know the answer to this.
Yeah. And he talks about with all of that and our want to help, we actually have to learn how to tame our advice monster. And he says similarly, like, this is not about throwing advice out. It's about how we actually slow down so that we understand what might be the real kind of things going on here. And then when we bring advice in, it's more collaborative rather than this expert model of advice giving. Yeah. That, like I said, it's quite hard not to hook into that. So, it's a great question, and one that I think requires reflection from us as practitioners around how do we start to slow down ourselves or not get so hooked into our advice monsters so that we can actually truly collaborate with parents.
Beautifully said. Beautiful answer. It's such a great reflection point, Jacqui. You're so right. You know, it's so instinctive, isn't it, to jump on in there. And but we all know what it feels like when we come up with a solution ourselves. It empowers us and we feel more confident. And we keep saying the parents are the expert. We can't keep saying, you know, you're the expert of your child. If we're the ones constantly coming and going, well, I know what you could do. And, you know, we have to follow through with that. And I love how you brought that up. So Advice Monster, I'll take a look at that. Thank you for the advice. Jacqui, I love that conversation. It was wonderful. I hope to all of our listeners you really enjoyed that as well. I think it's just such a reflection point for all of us in our practice. And, you know, it's not just for early intervention, is it? It's for across our practice, for the young people that we work with as well. And so if you want any more information on this, of course, we'll put a link for this through our website, researchworks.academy. Please have a look at this paper. It is just so worthwhile looking at it. If you want more information, go back to the previous episode as well to hear more about it, because we go into the attachment theory more in the previous one as well, and all the adult learning principles if you're interested in that. But Jacqui, congratulations on all of this work, and thank you so much for being on this podcast today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So good. To all of our listeners, welcome back to another part of, our podcast post EACD. I hope you're going to enjoy all the episodes that are coming up. There's so much more to come. We'll talk to you all again really soon. Goodbye, everyone.